Sometimes the most innocent hearts see what we adults miss completely. Sometimes a child's love can teach us everything we need to know about what really matters. When Officer Ray Dalton pulled up to Grace Community Church that Tuesday evening, he expected another routine noise complaint. Instead, he found 7-year-old Lily Henderson waiting on the front steps. She wore her best Sunday dress and clutched a wooden cross in her small hands. Tears streamed down her face as she spoke words that would change everything. "Please, officer, you have to arrest Pastor Jim. He's breaking the law, and if you don't stop him, they're going to take him away from us." Ray knelt down beside her, his heart breaking at the sight of this distressed child. What could this little girl possibly know about the law? What was really happening at this quiet neighborhood church? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ray Dalton had seen plenty of strange things in his 30 years wearing the badge, but a 7-year-old asking him to arrest her pastor wasn't one of them. He studied the little girl's face, noting the genuine distress in her wide brown eyes. The wooden cross she held looked handmade, rough around the edges, but polished smooth by countless small fingers. "Lily, sweetheart," he said gently, his voice taking on the tone he'd once used with his own daughter years ago. "Why don't you tell me what's really going on here?" The child's lower lip trembled. "Pastor Jim feeds people when they're hungry, even when the mean man in the suit says he can't. And he helps with my homework when Mama's working. But I heard Mrs. Patterson talking about how they might take him away because he's doing bad things." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "But he's not doing bad things, officer. He's doing good things." Ray's radio crackled, reminding him that dispatch expected a report on this noise complaint. But looking at this child, he realized this call was going to be anything but routine. He'd been a cop long enough to know when something deeper was brewing beneath the surface. "Let's go inside and talk to Pastor Jim together, okay?" Lily nodded solemnly and led him through the heavy wooden doors of Grace Community Church. The interior was humble but well-maintained. Worn pews that had witnessed decades of Sunday services, stained glass windows that cast colored patterns across the floor in the evening light, and the faint scent of candle wax and old wood that seemed to permeate every church Ray had ever entered. Pastor Jim Morrison was in the fellowship hall, ladling soup into styrofoam containers while a small group of people waited patiently in line. Ray recognized some of them. Mrs. Chen from the Asian market, old Pete who collected aluminum cans around town, Maria Santos and her 3 young children. These weren't troublemakers or criminals. These were neighbors who'd fallen on hard times. Jim looked up when Lily and Ray entered. He was a tall man, probably in his early 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His clothes were simple but clean: khaki pants, a button-down shirt, and an apron that read "World's Best Grandpa," though Ray knew from the church records that Jim had no children of his own. "Officer," Jim said, setting down the ladle and wiping his hands on the apron, "I imagine you're here about the noise complaint. Mrs. Patterson across the street has been calling the station regularly about our Tuesday dinners." Ray glanced around the hall. The noise appeared to be quiet conversation and the gentle clinking of spoons against bowls. A few children sat at a corner table working on homework while their parents ate. An elderly man dozed in a folding chair, a half-finished meal in front of him. "This is quite an operation you have here," Ray observed. Jim's expression grew cautious. "We serve a hot meal every Tuesday and Friday evening. Nothing fancy, usually soup, sandwiches. Sometimes Martha makes her famous casserole. Anyone who's hungry is welcome." "And how long have you been doing this?" "About 3 years now, since Sarah passed." Jim's voice softened when he mentioned the name. "My wife used to organize the church suppers. After she died, I noticed people were still hungry, still struggling. Seemed wrong to let that need go unmet just because we'd lost our best organizer." Ray watched Jim serve the last few people in line, noting how he knew everyone's name, asked about their children, remembered details about their lives. This wasn't some impersonal charity operation. This was a man who genuinely cared about his community. Lily tugged on Ray's uniform sleeve. "See, he takes care of everyone, but the mean suit man says it's against the rules." "What mean suit man, Lily?" Jim and the little girl exchanged a look. "City inspector came by last week," Jim said carefully. "Seems we're violating some zoning. Ordinances, food service without proper permits, exceeding occupancy limits, that sort of thing." Ray felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. He'd been a cop long enough to know when bureaucracy and human need collided, and it never ended well for anyone. The law was the law, but standing here watching Jim care for his neighbors, Ray found himself questioning what justice really meant. "Pastor." "Jim," called out a voice from across the room. An elderly woman with a walker was making her way slowly toward them. "You forgot to take your blood pressure medicine again, didn't you?" Jim smiled sheepishly. "Martha, you worry too much." "Someone has to," she replied, but her tone was affectionate. She turned to Ray. "Officer, I'm Martha Henderson, Lily's grandmother. I suppose you're here about our little family dinner." Ray studied Martha's face, noting the same determined expression Lily had worn on the church steps. "Mrs. Henderson, your granddaughter seems to think Pastor Jim is in some kind of trouble." Martha's expression hardened. "That child has been through enough trouble in her young life. Without watching the one stable adult figure, she has get hauled away by bureaucrats who don't understand what it means to take care of people." "Grandma," Lily whispered, tugging on Martha's sleeve. "It's all right, sweetheart." Martha's voice gentled as she looked down at her granddaughter, then back at Ray. "Officer, you seem like a decent man. You have children of your own?" The question hit Ray like a punch to the chest. "I have a daughter, Katie. She's grown now. Close." Ray hesitated. The honest answer was too complicated, too painful to share with strangers. "We don't talk as often as we should." Martha nodded as if she understood. "Perfectly. Lily's daddy left when she was 4. Just up and disappeared one day. Left my daughter Sarah. Yes, we named her after Pastor Jim's wife. With 3 jobs and a little girl who cried herself to sleep for months, wondering what she'd done wrong." Ray felt something twist in his chest. His own daughter had been about that age when his marriage fell apart, when the job and the drinking and his own inability to be the husband and father his family needed had driven them away. "Sarah works at the diner from 5 to noon, then cleans offices until 8, then stocks shelves at the grocery store until midnight," Martha continued. "That leaves Lily with me most of the time, which is fine except my arthritis has been acting up, and these days I need more help than I can give." "That's where Pastor Jim comes in," Ray guessed. "Every day after school, Lily comes here. Jim helps her with homework. Man taught high school English for 40 years before he became a pastor, you know. She has a snack, plays with the other. Children who show up, gets a proper dinner, and someone listens when she talks about her day." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "Do you understand what that means to a little girl who's lost so much?" Ray looked over at Lily, who was now sitting at the homework table with 2 other children, carefully working through math problems, while Jim looked over her shoulder and offered gentle guidance. The scene struck him with unexpected force. He remembered Katie at that age, struggling with fractions, asking for help that he'd been too tired or too distracted to give. "Officer Dalton," Jim approached, having finished cleaning up from the dinner service. "I want you to know that I understand you have a job to do. If there are violations, if we're breaking laws, then we need to address that. But these people," he gestured toward the families still lingering in the fellowship hall, "they're not statistics or case numbers. They're neighbors, and neighbors take care of each other." Ray found himself studying Jim's face, trying to read the man behind the gentle words. In 3 decades of police work, he'd developed a keen sense for people's motivations. Some folks broke laws for personal gain, others out of desperation or anger. But Jim Morrison, there was something different here, something Ray couldn't quite put his finger on. "Tell me about the violations," Ray said. Jim sighed, looking suddenly older. The inspector, Mr. Crane, says we're operating an unlicensed food service, says our occupancy exceeds what's permitted for a church gathering, says the overnight guests we've been sheltering violate residential zoning. Overnight guests? Sometimes. Folks have nowhere else to go. We have a small apartment above the church office that Sarah and I used to use as a guest room. If someone needs a place to sleep, we don't turn them away. Ray thought about the complaints Mrs. Patterson had filed. Noise, loitering, increased traffic. From her perspective, probably legitimate concerns. From Jim's perspective, probably desperate people finding help. From Ray's perspective, as a law enforcement officer, probably a whole lot of grey area that was going to give him a headache. "Pastor Jim," he said finally, "I'm going to need to see your permits, talk to some of the people you've been helping, maybe visit with this inspector who's been here. This isn't something I can resolve tonight." Jim nodded. "I understand. I'll get you whatever documentation you need. But I want you to understand something too," Ray continued. "I've been doing this job for a long time, and I can usually tell the difference between someone trying to help and someone trying to cause trouble. What I'm seeing here tonight, it doesn't look like trouble to me." Lily looked up from her homework, hope lighting up her small face. "Does that mean you won't arrest Pastor Jim?" Ray knelt down beside her again. "Sweetheart, I don't arrest people. We're trying to help their neighbors, but sometimes there are rules we have to follow to make sure everyone stays safe. Your Pastor Jim and I are going to work together to figure out the best way to do that, okay?" The little girl considered this carefully, then nodded. "Okay, but you promise you won't let the mean suit man take him away?" Ray felt the weight of that promise settling on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. He thought about his own daughter, about all the promises he'd broken over the years, about the kind of man he'd been versus the kind of man he wished he could be. "I promise I'll do everything I can to make sure the right thing happens," he said. It wasn't quite the promise Lily had asked for, but it was the only one Ray felt he could keep. As he prepared to leave the church that evening, taking notes and contact information for his report, he couldn't shake the feeling that this case was going to change something fundamental about how he saw his job, and maybe how he saw himself. Outside, the evening air was cool and quiet. Mrs. Patterson's house across the street was dark, except for one window where Ray could see the flicker of a television. He wondered what she saw when she looked across at the church. Probably disruption to her peaceful neighborhood. But Ray had looked inside tonight, had seen the faces of the people Jim was feeding, had watched Lily's small hand trustingly slip into the pastor's larger one. Sometimes the law was clear-cut. Sometimes it was complicated. And sometimes Ray was beginning to realize doing the right thing required more wisdom than the police academy had ever taught him. He climbed into his patrol car and sat for a moment, thinking about the report he'd need to file, thinking about Lily's tearful request, thinking about Jim Morrison's gentle certainty that neighbors should take care of each other, and thinking, despite himself, about his own daughter Katie, who he hadn't spoken to in 6 months and who probably wouldn't take his call if he tried. Maybe, Ray thought as he started the engine, it was time to figure out what kind of neighbor, what kind of father he really wanted to be. Ray spent the next morning doing what he did best, investigating. He pulled the complaints file on Grace Community Church and found a paper trail that painted a very different picture than what he'd witnessed the night before. Mrs. Patterson had filed 17 noise complaints in the past 6 months. The fire marshal had noted overcrowding concerns during an inspection, and Harold Crane, from the City Planning Department, had documented numerous violations in a report that read more like an indictment than a routine inspection. The violations were technical but serious: operating a food service without proper health department permits, exceeding occupancy limits during gatherings, providing overnight accommodation in a zone restricted to daytime religious activities, and operating what amounted to a homeless shelter without meeting residential building codes. Ray set the file down and rubbed his temples. Every charge was legitimate from a legal standpoint, But legitimacy and justice weren't always the same thing. His radio crackled. Unit 47, we have a situation at Grace Community Church. Inspector on scene requesting police presence. Ray's stomach dropped. On my way. When he arrived at the church, Harold Crane's black sedan was parked at an aggressive angle across 2 parking spaces. The man himself stood on the church steps with a clipboard and an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. He was younger than Ray had expected, probably in his 40s, wearing a grey suit that looked expensive and shoes that had never walked through anything messier than a parking lot. Officer Dalton, Crane said, extending a hand. His grip was firm but brief, the handshake of a man accustomed to getting his business done quickly. Thank you for coming. We have a situation here that requires immediate attention. Through the church windows, Ray could see Jim moving around inside, but the pastor hadn't come out to meet them. What kind of situation, Mr. Crane? Crane consulted his clipboard. Multiple health code violations, fire safety violations, and zoning violations. This facility is operating well outside its permitted parameters. He looked up at Ray with the confident expression of a man who believed the law was always on his side. I'm issuing a cease and desist order effective immediately. All unpermitted activities must stop, and the building must be vacated of any non-congregational use. That seems pretty drastic, Ray said carefully. These aren't minor infractions, officer. We're talking about public safety. Overcrowding, food service without proper permits, people sleeping in areas not zoned for residential use. Crane's voice carried the crisp efficiency of bureaucracy. The city has liability concerns. The church door opened and Jim emerged, followed by Lily and several other children. The little girl's face lit up when she saw Ray, but her expression quickly turned worried when she noticed Crane. That's the mean suit man, she whispered, moving closer to Jim. Crane heard her and his jaw tightened. Pastor Morrison, as I explained yesterday, you have 24 hours to cease all activities that violate city ordinances. That includes the meal service, the overnight guests, and any gatherings that exceed your occupancy permit. Jim's face remained calm, but Ray noticed the way his hand found Lily's shoulder in a protective gesture. Mr. Crane, I understand your concerns, but the people who come here, they need help. Where exactly do you suggest they go? That's not my department, Crane replied. There are proper channels for social services, homeless shelters, food banks, government assistance programs. Have you tried accessing those programs lately? Jim's voice remained gentle, but there was steel underneath. The nearest homeless shelter is 40 miles away and has a 6-month waiting list. The food bank operates 2 hours a week and serves maybe 30 families. Government assistance has been cut 3 times in the past 2 years. Crane's expression suggested he found these details irrelevant. Regardless, operating outside legal parameters puts the city at risk. Insurance liability alone. Insurance liability, Jim repeated quietly. Is that what we're calling hungry children now? Ray watched the exchange with growing unease. Both men were right from their own perspectives, but they were speaking completely different languages. Crane saw regulations and risk management. Jim saw faces and empty stomachs. Pastor Morrison, Ray said, stepping between them, maybe we could discuss some kind of compromise, ways to meet the city's requirements while still. There is no compromise, Crane interrupted. Either the activities cease or we shut down the facility entirely. Those are the options. Lily stepped forward, her small voice cutting through the adult conversation. You can't shut down our church. Where will I do my homework? Where will Mrs. Chen eat dinner? Where will Mr. Pete sleep when it's cold? Crane looked down at the child with obvious discomfort. Little girl, there are other places. No, there aren't, Lily said with the fierce certainty only children possess. I know because I asked. When Mama couldn't afford groceries last month, Pastor Jim bought them. When Grandma got sick, he paid for her medicine. When it was really cold and Mr. Pete was sleeping outside, Pastor Jim let him stay in the guest room. Her voice grew stronger with each word. You want to stop him from helping people. That makes you the bad guy. Lily, Jim said gently, but the little girl wasn't finished. Officer Ray, you have to arrest Pastor Jim before this mean man does something worse to him. If he's in jail, at least we'll know where he is. And maybe you can keep him safe until we figure out how to stop the bad things from happening. Ray felt the pieces click into place. The child's request the night before hadn't been nonsensical. It had been the desperate logic of someone who'd lost too much already. In Lily's world, the people who were supposed to protect you sometimes disappeared. But jail was a concrete place, somewhere she could visit, somewhere the mean suit man couldn't make Jim vanish entirely. The realization hit Ray like a physical blow. This 7-year-old was trying to protect the one stable adult in her life, the only way she knew how. Crane checked his watch impatiently. Pastor Morrison, you have until tomorrow evening to comply with the cease and desist order. Officer Dalton, I trust you'll ensure compliance. Ray found himself at a crossroads that felt bigger than a simple zoning dispute. On one side was the law, clear, unambiguous, bureaucratically sound. On the other side was a little girl who'd already learned that the adults she depended on could disappear without warning. I'll make sure Pastor Morrison understands the situation, Ray said carefully. After Crane left, Ray found himself sitting on the church steps with Jim, while Lily and the other children played in the small garden behind the building. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the parking lot. She's been through a lot, Jim said, watching Lily help a younger child tie his shoes. More than any 7-year-old should have to handle. You mentioned her father left. Jim nodded. One day he was there, the next he wasn't. No explanation, no goodbye. Sarah, that's Lily's mother, found a note on the kitchen table saying he couldn't handle the responsibility anymore. Jim's voice carried old pain. Lily kept asking when Daddy was coming home. Eventually she stopped asking, but she never stopped watching the door during dinner, hoping. Ray thought about his own daughter, about the nights he'd come home late or not at all, about the promises he'd broken and the trust he'd damaged. How do you help a child understand that kind of abandonment? You don't, Jim said simply. You just show up every day and prove that not all adults disappear when things get difficult. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the children play. Ray found himself thinking about the cease and desist order, about Crane's confident dismissal of human need, about the choice he was going to have to make. Pastor Jim, he said finally, what if you can't comply with the order? What if there's no way to help these people within the legal parameters? Jim considered the question carefully. Then I suppose I'll have to decide what's more important. Following the letter of the law or following my conscience. That could mean criminal charges, fines, maybe jail time. I know, Jim's voice was steady. But I also know that my wife didn't spend 40 years feeding hungry people just so I could abandon them when things got complicated. And I know that little girl in there has already watched one man she trusted walk away. I won't be the second. Ray understood then why Lily had asked him to arrest Pastor Jim. She'd recognized something Ray was only beginning to see, that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is accept the consequences of doing what's right, even when the system says it's wrong. As Ray prepared to leave that afternoon, Lily ran up to him with a piece of paper covered in careful crayon drawings. "What's this, sweetheart?" "It's a picture of everyone Pastor Jim helps," she explained seriously. "See, there's Mrs. Chen and Mr. Pete and my mama and Grandma Martha. And there's you too, because you're going to help us figure out how to keep Pastor Jim safe." Ray looked down at the drawing, stick figures holding hands around a building that was unmistakably the church. In a child's simple rendering, he saw something that all of Crane's regulations and violations had missed: a community. "Lily," he said, kneeling down to her level, "what if helping Pastor Jim means making some grown-ups very angry? What if it means I might get in trouble too?" Lily considered this with the seriousness of someone far older than her years. "Grandma, Martha says that doing the right thing is sometimes scary, but that's what makes brave people different from regular people. They do the right thing anyway." Ray folded the drawing carefully and put it in his uniform pocket. As he drove away from the church that evening, he carried with him the weight of a child's trust and the growing certainty that the next 24 hours were going to change everything. That evening, Ray did something he hadn't done in years. He went home and cooked dinner. Not the usual microwaved meal or takeout, but actual cooking. As he stood in his small kitchen, browning ground beef for spaghetti sauce, he found himself thinking about Sarah Morrison's recipe box. Jim had mentioned it briefly during their conversation, how his late wife had organized church dinners and community meals for decades. Ray imagined her hands writing out recipes in careful script, planning meals that would stretch to feed whoever showed up hungry. He wondered what it felt like to build a life around caring for others so completely. His own kitchen felt hollow by comparison. The refrigerator held beer, leftover pizza, and expired milk. The cabinets contained mostly canned soup and the kind of processed foods that required no thought or planning. It was the kitchen of a man who'd forgotten how to nurture, maybe even how to hope. While the sauce simmered, Ray opened his laptop and began researching Pastor Jim Morrison. What he found painted a picture of a man who dedicated his entire adult life to service. 42 years teaching high school English in 3 different districts, always in the schools, with the most challenging student populations. He'd coached debate teams, directed school plays, and tutored struggling students long after the final bell rang. After retirement, he'd attended seminary and been ordained at age 65. He'd married Sarah Patterson, the former Sarah Patterson. Ray noted with interest, wondering if this was connected to the Mrs. Patterson who'd been filing complaints. They'd had no children of their own, but the local newspaper archives showed photos of them at dozens of community events, always surrounded by other people's children, always smiling. Sarah had died 3 years ago after a brief battle with cancer. The obituary mentioned that in lieu of flowers, donations should be made to the church food pantry. Even in death, she'd been thinking about feeding others. Ray found himself studying a photo from the church's website, Jim and Sarah at what appeared to be a Christmas dinner, standing behind a long table laden with food, surrounded by families. Sarah was smaller than he'd imagined, probably in her 60s, with grey hair and laugh lines around her eyes. Jim's arm was around her waist, and both of them were beaming at whoever was taking the picture. The caption read, "Pastor Jim and Sarah." Morrison served Christmas dinner to over 150 community members, continuing a tradition Sarah started 20 years ago when she noticed some families had no place to celebrate the holiday. Ray closed the laptop and took his dinner to the living room, but found he had little appetite. The research had only deepened his dilemma. This wasn't a case of some well-meaning amateur overstepping boundaries. Jim Morrison was a man who'd spent his entire life learning how to serve others effectively, guided by a woman who'd apparently been just as committed to caring for their community. His phone rang, pulling him from his thoughts. The caller ID showed his supervisor, Captain Martinez. "Dalton, I understand you've got a situation at the Grace Community Church. Harold Crane called, says there are serious violations that need immediate enforcement." Ray chose his words carefully. "It's complicated, Captain. There are definitely regulatory issues, but the pastor seems to be genuinely trying to help people in need. Regulations exist for good reasons, Ray. Public safety, liability concerns, proper oversight of charitable operations." Martinez's tone was matter-of-fact, not unkind, but clearly focused on procedure. "What's your timeline for resolution?" Crane gave them 24 hours to comply with a cease and desist order. "Good. That should be sufficient time to shut down whatever unlicensed operations they're running. File your report by Friday." After Martinez hung up, Ray sat in his dark living room, staring at the untouched plate of spaghetti. The conversation had been exactly what he'd expected: efficient, procedural, completely disconnected from the human faces he'd seen at the church. He thought about Lily's drawing, still folded in his uniform pocket. Stick figures holding hands around a simple building. In a child's understanding, the solution was clear. Good people took care of each other, and anyone trying to stop that was the enemy. If only adult problems could be solved with that kind of moral clarity. Ray's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Officer Dalton, this is Martha Henderson, Lily's grandmother. Could you come by tomorrow morning? There are some things about Pastor Jim I think you should know, things that might help you understand why this matters so much. Ray stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, I'll be there at 9. The next morning, Ray found Martha Henderson waiting for him on her small front porch, 2 cups of coffee steaming on the table between the wicker chairs. Her house was a modest bungalow 3 blocks from the church, with a garden that showed signs of careful tending despite her arthritis. Thank you for coming, Martha said, as Ray settled into the chair beside her. I know you're in a difficult position with all this. Ray accepted the coffee gratefully. It was strong and black, exactly how he liked it. Mrs. Henderson, I want you to know that I'm trying to find a solution that works for everyone. Martha studied his face with the shrewd assessment of someone who'd lived long enough to distinguish between genuine intention and polite deflection. Tell me about your daughter, Officer Dalton. The question caught him off guard. My daughter? Yesterday you mentioned you have a grown daughter named Katie. You got a look on your face when you said her name, the look of a father who loves his child but hasn't figured out how to show it properly. Ray felt exposed, as if this elderly woman could see straight through all his careful professional composure. We don't have the best relationship. Why is that? The job, mostly. Too many missed dinners, broken promises. Her mother and I divorced when Katie was 12. I wasn't... He paused, surprised by how easily the words were coming. I wasn't the father she needed me to be. Martha nodded, as if she'd expected this answer. And now she's 28, married, has a little boy of her own, lives in Colorado. We talk maybe twice a year, and usually it's stilted, polite. Conversation that doesn't say anything real. Do you love her? More than my own life, Ray said without hesitation. Then why don't you tell her that? Ray stared into his coffee cup. Because I hurt her. Because I made promises I couldn't keep, and because maybe it's too late to fix the damage I caused. Martha was quiet for a moment, watching a cardinal flutter among the branches of her oak tree. Pastor Jim never had children of his own, she said finally. Did you know that? Ray shook his head. Sarah had 3 miscarriages in their early years of marriage. They tried for adoption, but back then, older couples weren't considered ideal candidates. It broke Sarah's heart, and Jim's too, though he never said much about it. Martha reached into her sweater pocket and pulled out a small wooden box, setting it on the table between them. This belonged to Sarah. She kept her most treasured recipes. In here, not just the ingredients and instructions, but notes about who she was cooking for and why. Ray opened the box carefully. Inside were dozens of index cards covered in faded handwriting. The top card was for Sarah's famous casserole, with a note scrawled at the bottom. Make extra. The Jenkins family always needs seconds, and little Tommy won't eat vegetables any other way. She wrote notes like this on every recipe, Martha continued. Not just how to make the food, but who needed it and why. Look at this one. Ray pulled out a card titled Birthday Cake for Kids Without Parties. The recipe was standard, but the margins were filled with names and dates. Marcus, foster care, age 7, loves chocolate. Emma, parents going through divorce, turns 9 next week. David, family can't afford celebration, first birthday since Dad's accident. Sarah and Jim turned their whole lives into a ministry of caring for other people's children, Martha said, softly. Every child who walked through those church doors became theirs in some way. They went to school plays, graduation ceremonies, helped with college applications, paid for things parents couldn't afford. Ray continued reading through the cards, each one revealing another layer of intentional love. Sarah Morrison hadn't just cooked food. She'd crafted experiences, built memories, created belonging for children who needed it most. Lily's been going to that church since she was 4, Martha continued. When her daddy left, she stopped talking for almost 2 months. Wouldn't eat, barely slept, kept asking me if she'd been too loud or too messy, if that's why he went away. Ray's chest tightened. He remembered Katie going through a similar phase after the divorce. The way she'd become almost invisible, as if making herself smaller might prevent any more important people from leaving. Jim started having her help him in the church kitchen, Martha said. Nothing complicated, washing vegetables, stirring soup, setting tables. But he talked to her while they worked, really talked, not the kind of adult conversation that talks around children. He listened to her worries, answered her questions honestly, let her help make decisions about who needed what kind of care. Martha closed the recipe box gently. That little girl learned how to hope again, because a man who'd never had children of his own decided she was worth saving. And now, some bureaucrat with a clipboard wants to destroy the only stable, loving relationship she's ever known with a male adult. Ray understood now why Martha had wanted him to see Sarah's recipe box. It wasn't just about food. It was about the architecture of love, the way 2 people had built their entire life around creating family for those who needed one. Mrs. Henderson, he said carefully, what exactly are you asking me to do? Martha. Henderson leaned forward in her chair, her weathered hands clasping her coffee cup like an anchor. I'm asking you to see what I see when I look at that church, Officer Dalton. Not building codes and permits, but children who've learned they matter to someone. She stood slowly, favoring her arthritic hip, and gestured for Ray to follow her. Inside, the house was neat and comfortable, filled with the kind of furniture that had been carefully chosen and lovingly maintained for decades. Family photos covered the mantel and side tables, Lily at various ages, a young woman Ray assumed was her mother, and what looked like 3 generations of family gatherings. Martha led him to a small desk in the corner where a manila folder lay open. These are Lily's report cards, she said, pulling out several papers. Look at this one from 2 years ago, right after her father left. Ray examined the document. Lily's grades from kindergarten told a story of decline, A's and B's, in the first semester dropping to C's and D's by spring. The teacher's comments were diplomatic but clear. Lily seems distracted and withdrawn, has difficulty concentrating, often appears tired. Now look at this one from last year, Martha said, handing him another report card. The transformation was remarkable. Lily's grades had not only recovered but improved beyond her original performance. More telling were the teacher's notes. Lily is a joy to have in class. She's confident, helpful to other students, and excited about learning. Her reading comprehension has improved dramatically. What changed? Ray asked, though he suspected he already knew. Jim started tutoring her every day after school. Not just homework help, he made learning fun again. He'd have her read stories aloud, then act them out with the other children. Math became cooking measurements for church dinners. Science became gardening projects behind the church. Martha pulled out another folder, this one containing what appeared to be creative writing assignments. Read this one. She wrote it 3 months ago for a school essay contest about heroes. Ray unfolded the paper, written in Lily's careful 7-year-old handwriting, My Hero by Lily Henderson. My hero is Pastor Jim. He is not a superhero with a cape, but he saves people anyway. When my daddy left, I was very sad and scared. I thought, maybe I was a bad girl and that's why he went away. But Pastor Jim told me that sometimes grown-ups make choices that hurt children, and it's not the children's fault. Pastor Jim teaches me math with cooking and reading with acting. He never gets angry when I don't understand something. He just finds a different way to explain it. He says every person is important and deserves to be taken care of. When Mrs. Chen couldn't afford groceries, Pastor Jim bought them. When Mr. Pete was sleeping outside, Pastor Jim gave him a warm place to sleep. When Mama couldn't pay for my school, Supplies, Pastor Jim got them for me, but he didn't tell Mama because he didn't want her to feel bad. Pastor Jim says that being a hero isn't about having superpowers. It's about using whatever power you have to help people who need it. That's why he's my hero. He uses his power to make sure no one goes hungry or sleeps outside or feels forgotten. I want to be like Pastor Jim when I grow up. I want to help people and make them feel important. Ray felt something shift in his chest as he read the essay. The child's understanding of heroism was both simple and profound, using whatever power you have to help those who need it. She won first place in her age group, Martha said quietly. Jim framed the certificate and hung it in the church office where Lily can see it every day. Ray folded the essay carefully and handed it back. Mrs. Henderson, I understand why this matters to your family, but Inspector Crane isn't wrong about the legal issues. There are real safety concerns, insurance liabilities. Show me, Martha interrupted. Show me one incident where someone was actually hurt by what Pastor Jim is doing. Show me one complaint from anyone who's actually been helped by him. Ray realized he couldn't. All the complaints had come from neighbors concerned about property values and increased activity, not from anyone who'd actually participated in the church's programs. The homeless man who sleeps in the apartment upstairs sometimes, Mr. Pete, he's a Vietnam veteran with PTSD. Would he be safer sleeping in doorways or under bridges? The single mothers who bring their children for dinner and homework help, are they better off isolated and struggling alone? The elderly people who come for companionship and a warm meal, should they just accept that loneliness and hunger are part of aging? Martha's voice carried the passion of someone who'd watched bureaucracy destroy good things before. I've lived in this neighborhood for 43 years, Officer Dalton. I've seen what happens when people stop caring about each other, when everyone retreats behind their own doors and pretends that other people's problems aren't their responsibility. She moved to the window and pointed toward the church. 3 years ago, this neighborhood was dying. Young families moving away, elderly people isolated, businesses closing down. Then Jim started his community dinners, and something changed. People began talking to each other again. Children had safe places to play. Neighbors started helping neighbors. Ray found himself thinking about his own neighborhood, a complex of apartments where he'd lived for 5 years without learning the names of the people next door. Where was the community in that? Where was the caring? Martha, he said, what if there was a way to make this legal? What if Pastor Jim could get the proper permits, meet the safety requirements, work within the system instead of outside it? Martha's expression was skeptical. Have you looked into what that would require? The health department permits alone would cost thousands of dollars. Fire safety upgrades, commercial kitchen equipment, liability insurance. Where do you think that money would come from? Ray had to admit he hadn't considered the financial reality. Jim was using his own pension and savings to help people. He certainly didn't have the resources for major renovations and regulatory compliance. But more than that, Martha continued, the regulations would change the nature of what he's doing. No overnight guests. Where does that leave Mr. Pete when it's 20 degrees outside? Strict occupancy limits. What happens when more people need help than the permits allow? Mandatory background checks and intake procedures. How do you think that would feel to families who are already ashamed of needing assistance? Ray understood. The regulations weren't just bureaucratic hurdles. They would fundamentally alter the open-door, no-questions-asked nature of Jim's ministry. So, what's the alternative, he asked. Let Inspector Crane shut everything down. The question hit Ray like a physical blow. He thought about those dark years when his marriage was falling apart, when the job stress was overwhelming, when he'd turned to alcohol instead of reaching out for help. If there had been a Pastor Jim in his life then, someone who offered support without strings attached, who saw the person behind the badge, who might have helped him become the father Katie needed, would things have been different? Maybe, he said quietly. maybe everything would have been different. Martha nodded as if she'd seen the recognition in his eyes. That's what you're really choosing between, Officer Dalton. Not regulations and violations, but whether people like you, people who are struggling and don't know where to turn, have someplace safe to land. Ray's radio crackled with a routine call, reminding him that the outside world was continuing its business while he sat in Martha Henderson's living room, having his assumptions challenged by a grandmother who understood human nature better than most professionals. "I need to get back to work," he said, standing. "But Mrs. Henderson, Martha, thank you for showing me those report cards. And the essay." "Officer Dalton," Martha called as he reached the door. "My granddaughter asked you to arrest Pastor Jim because she's 7 years old, and that's the only way she could think of to keep him safe from people who might hurt him. But you're a grown man with experience and authority. Surely you can think of a better way." As Ray walked back to his patrol car, he felt the weight of Martha's challenge settling on his shoulders. Lily had asked him to arrest Pastor Jim out of love and desperation. Martha was asking him to find a way to protect what Jim was doing out of wisdom and hope. Both requests required him to be something more than just a police officer following orders. They required him to be the kind of person who used whatever power he had to help those who needed it, exactly the kind of hero Lily had described in her essay about Pastor Jim. That afternoon, Ray found himself doing something he hadn't done in over 6 months. He dialed his daughter's number. The phone rang 4 times before Katie's voicemail picked up, her voice bright and professional. "Hi, you've reached Katie Morrison. Please leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as possible." Morrison. She'd taken her husband's name. Of course. But hearing it still caught Ray off guard every time. His little girl was now Katie Morrison, wife and mother, living a life he knew almost nothing about. "Katie, it's Dad," he said after the beep, then immediately felt awkward about how to continue. "I know it's been a while since we talked. I'm working on a case that's got me thinking about family, about the choices we make for the people we love. Anyway, I hope you and David and little Michael are doing well. Maybe we could talk sometime. I love you." He hung up feeling both relieved and anxious. Reaching out to Katie had become increasingly difficult over the years, each failed conversation adding another layer of distance between them. But sitting in Martha Henderson's living room, reading Lily's essay about heroes, Ray had realized that he'd been so focused on his past failures as a father that he'd stopped trying to be one in the present. His phone buzzed with a text. "Dad, is everything okay? You sounded worried." "I'm at work but can call you tonight around 8. Ray stared at the message, surprised by how quickly she'd responded and by the concern in her words. Maybe the distance between them wasn't as vast as he'd imagined. He was still thinking about Katie. When he arrived at the police station and found Inspector Harold Crane waiting in the lobby, looking impatient and official. "Officer Dalton, I need to know the status of the Grace Community Church situation. My supervisor is asking for an update." Ray gestured toward the conference room. "Let's talk privately." Once they were seated, Ray pulled out his notebook and tried to approach the conversation professionally. "Mr. Crane, I've done a thorough investigation of the church's activities. While there are certainly regulatory issues, I haven't found evidence of any actual harm or danger to the community." Crane's expression hardened. "Officer, harm and danger aren't limited to immediate physical injury. We're talking about liability exposure, insurance violations, health department concerns. The city can't simply ignore established regulations. Because the violations seem well-intentioned. What if we could work with Pastor Morrison to address the compliance issues gradually? Maybe set up a timeline for getting proper permits, making necessary safety improvements." "The cease and desist order was clear," Crane interrupted. "All unpermitted activities must stop immediately. There's no provision for gradual compliance." Ray studied Crane's face, noting the man's rigid adherence to procedure. "Can I ask you something? Have you actually spent time at the church? Seen what they're doing there?" "I don't need to spend time there. I have the inspection reports, the violation. documentation, the regulatory requirements. This isn't about emotions or good intentions, it's about legal compliance. But surely the context matters. These are families in need, children who depend on... Crane stood abruptly. Officer Dalton, with all due respect, your job is to enforce the law, not to evaluate the social merits of illegal activities. I need your assurance that the cease and desist order will be enforced by tomorrow evening. Ray felt a familiar frustration building, the same feeling he'd had countless times over his career when the system's inflexibility collided with human complexity. And if Pastor Morrison refuses to comply, then you arrest him for violating a lawful order. It's that simple. After Crane left, Ray sat in the empty conference room, staring at his notebook. The words, "arrest him," echoed in his mind, and he thought about Lily's tearful request 2 days ago. She'd seen this moment coming. Before any of the adults had, his phone rang. "Captain Martinez, Ray, I just got off the phone with the city manager. Apparently there's been some pressure from the community about this church situation, people calling in, asking questions about the investigation." "What kind of pressure?" "The supportive kind mostly. Neighbors defending the pastor, families, saying he's helped them. But there's also been complaints about increased activity in the neighborhood, concerns about property values." Martinez paused. "The point is, this is getting attention. I need you to wrap it up quickly and cleanly." "Captain, I think there might be more to this situation than a simple zoning violation." "What do you mean?" Ray hesitated, trying to find the right words. The pastor is genuinely helping people, families who don't have anywhere else to turn. Shutting him down might solve the regulatory problem, but it's going to create a bigger human problem. Ray, you've been doing this job long enough to know that we can't make exceptions to the law based on good intentions. If every well-meaning person who violated regulations got a pass, we'd have chaos. I understand that, but no buts. The inspector issued a lawful order. Either it's enforced or we undermine the entire regulatory system. End of discussion. That evening, Ray sat in his apartment with a stack of files spread across his coffee table. Not case files, but personal documents he hadn't looked at in years. His divorce papers, custody arrangements, birthday cards he'd bought for Katie but never sent because he wasn't sure if she wanted to hear from him. At the bottom of the stack, he found a folder labeled "Letters to Katie," drafts of things he'd wanted to say to his daughter over the years, but had never found the courage to send. Apologies for missed recitals, explanations for why the job had consumed so much of his time and energy, expressions of pride in the woman she'd become despite his failures as a father. Ray opened one of the letters, dated 3 years ago. "Dear Katie, I know I haven't been the father you deserved, and I know that saying I'm sorry doesn't undo the damage I caused. I think about you every day, wonder what you're doing, how you're feeling, what you're learning. I want to know about your job, your husband, your dreams for the future. I want to be part of your life, but I don't know how to bridge the gap between who I was and who I want to be now. Your mother was right when she said I chose the job over my family too many times. I thought I was providing for you, protecting you by being a good cop. But I realize now that what you needed was a father who was present, who listened, who showed up for the moments that mattered. I love you more than I know how to say, and I hope that someday we can find our way back to each other. Dad." He'd written similar letters dozens of times, but had never sent any of them. Always, he'd convinced himself that Katie was better off without his failed attempts at connection, that reaching out would only remind her of his shortcomings. But reading the letter now, after spending 2 days watching Jim Morrison's relationship with Lily, Ray realized he'd been using his guilt as an excuse for continued absence. Jim had never had biological children of his own, but he'd chosen to show up for dozens of other people's children. Meanwhile, Ray had a daughter who was his own flesh and blood, and he'd spent years avoiding her because facing his mistakes felt too difficult. At exactly 8 o'clock, his phone rang. "Katie." "Hi, Dad," she said, and Ray was struck by how much. Her voice sounded like her mother's. "Your message today sounded different somehow. What's going on?" Ray found himself telling her about the case, about Lily and Pastor Jim, about the choice he was facing between following orders and protecting something precious. As he talked, he realized he was sharing more honest thoughts with his daughter than he had in years. "Dad," Katie said when he finished, "it sounds like you're trying to decide what kind of person you want to be." "I guess I am. For what it's worth, the father I remember from when I was little, before things got complicated, he would have found a way to protect that little girl and her pastor. He would have figured out how to do the right thing, even if it was difficult." After they hung up, after Katie had promised to call again soon, after she'd told him she loved him and wanted him to meet his grandson, Ray sat in his quiet apartment and thought about heroes. About Lily's essay, about Jim's quiet dedication, about the difference between following rules and following conscience. Tomorrow, Harold Crane would expect him to enforce the cease and desist order. Captain Martinez would expect him to file a report confirming compliance. The system would expect him to choose duty over disruption. But Katie's words echoed in his mind. The father she remembered would have found a way to protect what mattered most. Ray realized that the choice facing him wasn't just about Pastor Jim and the church. It was about who he wanted to be for the rest of his life. The kind of cop who enforced regulations without question, or the kind of man who used whatever power he had to help those who needed it. Ray arrived at Grace Community Church the next morning to find an ambulance in the parking lot, its red and blue lights cutting through the early dawn quiet. His heart hammered as he hurried toward the building, fearing the worst. Inside, he found Martha Henderson sitting in one of the front pews, her face pale but composed, while paramedics checked her blood pressure. Lily sat beside her grandmother, holding Martha's hand and whispering reassurances with the practiced calm of a child who'd learned to be strong in crisis. "What happened?" Ray asked, approaching carefully. "Mrs. Henderson had a dizzy spell this morning," explained one of the paramedics. "Blood pressure's elevated, but she's stable. We're recommending a hospital visit for more thorough evaluation." Martha shook her head firmly. "I'm not going to any hospital. I've got Lily to take care of, and I can't afford—" "Grandma," Lily interrupted gently, "you have to go. I'll be okay. Pastor Jim will take care of me." Ray looked around and realized Jim wasn't in the sanctuary. "Where is Pastor Morrison?" "At the hospital," Martha said quietly. "He's been there all night. Mrs. Chen's little boy had an asthma attack, and she couldn't afford the emergency room costs. Jim went with them, told the hospital he'd handle the bills." The paramedic frowned. "Ma'am, your blood pressure is dangerously high. This isn't optional." Ray watched Martha's face cycle through. Worry, frustration, and fear. Here was a woman who'd spent her life taking care of others, suddenly faced with her own vulnerability and the impossible choice between her health and her granddaughter's security. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, kneeling beside the pew, "I'll stay with Lily until Pastor Jim gets back from the hospital. She won't be alone." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "Officer, you don't understand. My insurance doesn't cover emergency room visits at St. Mary's. The co-pays alone—" "Let me worry about that," Ray heard himself saying. "Right now, the important thing is making sure you're okay." As the paramedics prepared to transport Martha, Lily pressed something into Ray's hand. It was a plastic hospital bracelet, worn and faded. "That's from when Grandma was in the hospital before," Lily explained, "when she got really sick and couldn't breathe right. Pastor Jim stayed with me for 3 whole days until she came home." Ray studied the bracelet. Martha Henderson, admitted 6 months ago for pneumonia. He could imagine Jim stepping in without question, caring for Lily as if she were his own granddaughter, making sure she felt safe and loved while Martha recovered. After the ambulance left, Ray found himself alone in the church with Lily and a profound sense of responsibility. This 7-year-old had already watched one parent abandon her, had seen her grandmother rush to the hospital twice, had experienced more uncertainty and loss than most adults could handle. "Are you scared?" he asked, settling into the pew beside her. Lily considered the question seriously. A little, but Pastor Jim says being scared doesn't mean you give up. It just means you have to be extra brave. He's right about that. Will you really stay with me until he comes back? I promised. I would, didn't I? Lily nodded, then surprised him by leaning against his arm. You remind me of my daddy a little, but different. Ray's throat tightened. Different how? My daddy was tall like you, and he had kind eyes like you. But when things got scary, he left you stay. The simple observation hit Ray like a punch to the chest. He thought about all the times he'd left when Katie needed him, missed recitals, cancelled fishing trips, late nights at the office when he should have been home reading bedtime stories. Lily, he said carefully, what if I told you that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes? That sometimes we leave when we should stay, but that doesn't mean we don't love the people we're supposed to take care of. Lily was quiet for a long moment, processing this idea. Do you think my daddy still loves me? Ray felt the weight of the question, understanding that his answer would become part of this child's understanding of herself and her worth. I think your daddy loves you very much. But sometimes people have problems they don't know how to solve. Sometimes they make choices that hurt the people they love most. And that's not about you being lovable. That's about them being scared or confused, or not knowing how to be the person they want to be. Is that why you and your daughter don't talk very much? The question startled Ray with its perceptiveness. How did you know about that? You got the same sad look when you mentioned her that I get when people ask about my daddy. Ray realized that this child's experience with abandonment had made her unusually skilled at reading adult pain. Yes, that's part of it. I made mistakes when she was little, and I've been afraid that trying to fix them would just make things worse. But you called her yesterday, didn't you? Grandma Martha says that trying to fix mistakes is braver than pretending they didn't happen. Before Ray could respond, the church door opened and Jim entered, looking exhausted and worried. His clothes were wrinkled from sleeping in a hospital chair, and his usually neat hair was disheveled. Ray, Officer Dalton, what are you doing here? Where's Martha? She had a medical emergency this morning. High blood pressure. They took her to St. Mary's about an hour ago. Jim sank into the pew across from them, suddenly looking every one of his 72 years. How is she? Stable, but they want to keep her for observation. How's Mrs. Chen's little boy? Tommy's going to be okay. Severe asthma attack, but the doctor's got it under control. Jim rubbed his face tiredly. The hospital bill is going to be substantial, though. Maria's insurance doesn't cover much, and she's already working 3 jobs just to make rent. Ray watched Jim calculate the financial reality in his head, saw the man mentally reorganizing his own limited resources to cover another family's crisis. Pastor Jim, can I ask you something personal? Jim nodded. How much of your own money have you spent helping people over the past 3 years? Jim was quiet for a long moment. I don't really keep track. When someone needs help, you help them. That's what Sarah and I always believed. But your pension, your savings, there has to be a limit to what you can afford. Officer Dalton, do you have children? A daughter? If she called you tomorrow and said she needed help, medical bills, rent money, whatever, would you hesitate because of your budget? Ray understood immediately. For Jim, every person who came through those church doors had become family. The elderly man sleeping upstairs, the single mothers bringing their children for dinner, the struggling students who stayed for homework help, they were all his children in the ways that mattered most. The inspector's deadline is tonight, Ray said quietly. Jim nodded. I know. What are you going to do? I'm going to keep doing what I've been doing. Feeding hungry people, providing shelter for those who need it, making sure children have safe places to learn and grow. Jim's voice was calm but resolute. If that means I get arrested, then I suppose that's what happens. Lily looked up at both men, her young face serious. Pastor Jim, remember what you taught me about being brave? Sometimes the scariest thing is also the right thing? Jim smiled at her, reaching over to smooth her hair. That's right, sweetheart. Then I think Officer Ray is trying to be brave too. He wants to help us, but he's scared of getting in trouble with his boss. Ray felt exposed by the child's simple assessment. She was right. He was caught between his desire to protect what Jim was doing and his fear of the professional consequences. "Lily," he said, "what if being brave meant finding a different way to solve the problem? What if there was a way to help Pastor Jim without anyone getting arrested? Is there?" Ray looked at Jim, then at Lily, then at the hospital bracelet still clutched in his hand. A reminder of all the people who depended on this church, this man, this fragile community of care that bureaucracy was threatening to destroy. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I think it's time for me to find out." Ray spent the afternoon doing what 30 years of police work had taught him to do best. He investigated, but this time he wasn't investigating Pastor Jim Morrison. He was investigating Harold Crane. Something about the inspector's rigid insistence on immediate compliance had struck Ray as off. Most city officials, when faced with a situation involving community services and vulnerable people, would at least consider compromise solutions. Crane's absolute refusal to discuss alternatives felt less like bureaucratic procedure and more like personal agenda. Ray started with public records. Crane had been employed by the city planning department for 8 years, with a generally unremarkable record. But when Ray dug deeper into recent projects Crane had overseen, a pattern began to emerge. In the past 2 years, Crane had been involved in the closure or relocation of 3 community service organizations, all in neighborhoods that had subsequently seen new commercial or residential development. The connection might have been coincidental, except for one detail that caught Ray's attention. In each case, the development projects had been undertaken by Meridian Properties, a company that seemed to specialize in transforming underutilized community spaces into upscale housing and retail. Ray's phone buzzed with a text from Katie. "Dad, been thinking about our conversation yesterday. Proud of you for caring so much about that little girl and her pastor. Sometimes doing the right thing means taking risks. Love you." The message strengthened Ray's resolve. He drove to the county clerk's office and spent an hour reviewing property records for the area around Grace Community Church. What he found made his stomach sink. Meridian Properties had been quietly purchasing land in a 3-block radius around the church for the past 18 months. According to the filings, they were planning a luxury condominium development called Heritage Hills, 36 units starting at $400,000, marketed as sophisticated urban living in a historic neighborhood setting. The only property they hadn't acquired was the church itself. Ray studied the development plans, noting how the proposed buildings would completely surround the church property. But the plans went further than that. They showed the church lot as future community green space, suggesting that Meridian expected to acquire that property as well. A record search revealed that Grace Community Church had been approached multiple times by Meridian Properties with purchase offers, all of which had been declined. The most recent offer, made just 2 months ago, was for $1.2 million, far above the property's assessed value. Ray felt the pieces clicking into place, like a puzzle he should have seen from the beginning. The noise complaints, the regulatory violations, the pressure for immediate closure, it all made sense if someone wanted the church property empty and available for sale. He called the number listed for Meridian Properties and asked to speak with the project manager for Heritage Hills. After being transferred twice, he found himself talking to a cheerful sales representative named Jennifer. "Oh, Heritage Hills is going to be wonderful," she gushed. "Luxury condos with all the amenities, walking distance to downtown, and we're planning a beautiful community green space right in the center of the development where there's currently an old church." "An old church?" Ray kept his voice casual. "Is that property already part of the project?" "Well, not officially yet, but our development team is confident we'll acquire it soon." There have been some regulatory issues with the current owners, health code violations, zoning problems. Our understanding is that the city is working to resolve those issues, which should make the property available for purchase, Ray thanked. Jennifer hung up, his mind racing. Crane wasn't just enforcing regulations, he was clearing the way for a development deal. The cease and desist order wasn't about public safety. It was about making Jim's financial situation so untenable that he'd have no choice but to sell. But Ray needed more than circumstantial evidence. He needed proof of the connection between Crane and Meridian Properties. He spent the rest of the afternoon making discreet inquiries, calling contacts in other departments, checking public meeting records. What he found was a web of relationships that painted a clear picture of corruption. Harold Crane's wife, Patricia, worked as a marketing consultant. Her biggest client for the past 2 years had been Meridian Properties. Crane himself had attended multiple city planning meetings where Heritage Hills had been discussed, but had never disclosed his personal interest in the project's success. More damning still, Ray discovered that Crane had fast-tracked permits for 2 other Meridian developments while simultaneously intensifying regulatory enforcement against community organizations in those same areas. By evening, Ray had assembled a file that would end Crane's career and probably result in criminal charges. But as he sat in his car outside the church, watching Jim help children with homework through the windows, he realized that exposing Crane's corruption wouldn't necessarily save the church. The regulatory violations were still real, and another inspector could enforce them just as effectively. Ray's phone rang. It was Martha calling from the hospital. "Officer Dalton, how's Lily? Is she still with Pastor Jim?" "She's fine, Mrs. Henderson." "How are you feeling?" "Better, thank you. The doctors want to keep me overnight for observation, but I should be able to go home tomorrow." Martha's voice dropped. "Officer, I've been lying here thinking about what happens tonight, about Inspector Crane's deadline. Mrs. Henderson, there's something you need to know. I've been investigating Crane, and I think I know about the development company," Martha interrupted quietly. "I've known for months." Ray was stunned. "You knew, Officer Dalton? I've lived in this neighborhood for over 40 years. I've watched developers circle like vultures every time property values start to rise. When Meridian started buying up houses, and that inspector started finding problems with every community organization in the area, it wasn't hard to connect the dots. Then why didn't you say anything? Why didn't Pastor Morrison say anything?" Martha was quiet for a long moment. "Because knowing about corruption and proving it are 2 different things. And because Jim Morrison is the kind of man who believes in fighting problems with love, not lawsuits. But if people knew what was really happening—" "People do know, Officer Dalton. The families Jim helps, the neighbors who've watched their community change, the children who depend on that church, we all know. But knowing and having the power to do something about it are very different things." After Martha hung up, Ray sat in his car trying to process this revelation. The community had been aware of the larger forces threatening them, but they'd felt powerless to fight back against money and political connections. Ray thought about Lily's essay, about her definition of heroism as using whatever power you have to help people who need it. He looked down at the file of evidence against Crane, then at the church where Jim was still patiently helping children with their studies. Tomorrow morning he could present his findings to Captain Martinez, expose the corruption, maybe even save the church through legal channels. But that would take weeks or months, and in the meantime, Jim would still be facing arrest for violating the cease and desist order. Or Ray could walk into that church right now and do something that would immediately solve the problem, regardless of the consequences for his own career. His phone buzzed with another text from Katie. "Dad, whatever you decide to do about that church situation, just remember that some choices define who we are. I have faith in you." Ray looked at the message for a long time, then at the church windows where Jim was helping a little boy sound out words in a picture book. He thought about Lily's tearful request 3 days ago. "Please, officer, you have to arrest Pastor Jim." At the time, he'd thought it was the desperate logic of a child who didn't understand how the adult world worked. Now he realized it might have been the clearest thinking anyone had done about this situation. If Jim Morrison was going to be arrested anyway, if that was the inevitable outcome of standing up to corruption and bureaucracy, then maybe the question wasn't how to prevent it, but how to make it matter. Ray got out of his car, tucked the file of evidence against Crane into his jacket, and walked toward the church. He had a decision to make, and for the first time in years, he felt certain about which choice would let him sleep at night. The kind of man who used whatever power he had to help people who needed it wouldn't wait for the system to fix itself. He'd step into the gap between what was legal and what was right, and accept the consequences of choosing love over law. Ray found Jim in the church office, hunched over an old desk surrounded by stacks of papers and file folders. The pastor looked up when Ray entered, and the exhaustion in his eyes was evident. "Officer Dalton, I suppose you're here about the deadline." "Actually, I'm here about something else entirely." Ray closed the door behind him and sat down across from Jim. "I need to show you something." He spread the contents of his investigation across Jim's desk. Property records, development plans, evidence of Crane's connections to Meridian Properties. Jim studied the documents in silence, his expression growing more troubled with each page. "So this was never really about zoning violations," Jim said finally. "The violations are real, but they're being used as a weapon. Crane isn't trying to protect the community, he's trying to clear it out for developers." Jim leaned back in his chair, looking suddenly older. "You know what the saddest part is? I'm not even surprised. I've seen this pattern before, in other neighborhoods. Find reasons to shut down the organizations that serve the poor, make the area less attractive to low-income families, drive up property values, and sell to the highest bidder." Ray watched Jim's face, noting the resignation there. "But you're not going to fight it. How do you fight something like this? I'm a 72-year-old pastor with a dwindling congregation and a pension that barely covers my own expenses. Meridian Properties has lawyers, political connections, unlimited resources." Jim gestured to the papers spread across his desk. "Even if we expose Crane's corruption, they'll just find another inspector, another set of violations." "So you're giving up?" Jim was quiet for a long moment, then opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside, Ray could see a military medal, a bronze star, nestled in faded velvet. "I didn't tell you the whole truth about my background," Jim said quietly. "Before I became a teacher, I served in Vietnam, 2 tours as a chaplain with the 1st Cavalry Division." Ray studied the medal, noting the wear patterns that suggested it had been handled many times over the years. "You were in combat. Chaplains go where the soldiers go. I held dying boys in my arms, wrote letters to their mothers, said prayers over graves in the jungle." Jim's voice carried the weight of old memories. "I came home believing that the best way to honor those boys was to spend the rest of my life serving others." "Is that why you became a teacher? And later a pastor?" "Yes, but also why I can't walk away from people who need help, even when the smart thing would be to give up and let someone else deal with the problems." Jim closed the medal box and set it aside. "The thing about being in combat, Officer Dalton, is that you learn to distinguish between battles you can win and battles you have to fight regardless of the outcome. Sometimes the most important victories happen when you're willing to lose everything for something that matters more than your own safety." Ray understood. Jim wasn't planning to comply with the cease and desist order, even knowing it would result in his arrest. "What if I told you there might be another way?" Ray said. "What do you mean?" Ray took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to propose would change everything. "What if we made this fight public? What if instead of letting Crane shut you down quietly, we forced the whole community to witness what's really happening?" Jim frowned. "I don't understand. Tomorrow is Friday. That's when you normally serve dinner, right? What if you went ahead with the dinner as planned, knowing that Crane will call for your arrest? What if we made sure the local news was here? The neighbors were watching, the families you've helped understood that this was about more than zoning violations. You're talking about turning my arrest into a public demonstration. I'm talking about giving this community a chance to see what they're really choosing between corporate development and human compassion. Jim considered this, his fingers drumming against the desktop. And what about you, Officer Dalton? You'd be the one making the arrest. Are you prepared for the consequences of that? Ray had been thinking about this question all afternoon. Pastor Jim, 3 days ago, your 7-year-old friend asked me to arrest you because she thought it was the only way to protect you from something worse. I think she was right, just not in the way she imagined. Explain. If you get arrested quietly on a technical violation that most people don't understand, then Crane wins. The church closes, the community scatters, and Meridian Properties gets their development site. But if you get arrested publicly for the crime of feeding hungry people and sheltering the homeless, then everyone has to choose what kind of community they want to live in. Jim was quiet for several minutes, studying the development plans spread across his desk. Finally, he looked up at Ray. What exactly are you proposing? Friday evening dinner, as scheduled. You invite everyone, all the families you've been helping, the neighbors, anyone who's ever benefited from what you do here. When Crane shows up with the shutdown order, you refuse to comply. When he calls for your arrest, I make the arrest. But not before everyone present understands exactly what's happening and why. And then it's up to the community. Maybe they rally to support you. Maybe they pressure the city council to investigate Crane's connections. Maybe they demand that the real needs of this neighborhood be considered before approving luxury developments. Or maybe they decide that having a quiet neighborhood with higher property values is more important than having a place for struggling families to find help. Ray nodded. That's the risk. But at least they'll be making that choice with full knowledge of what's at stake. Jim stood and walked to the window overlooking the small garden behind the church. Ray could see him thinking through the implications, weighing the potential outcomes. There's something else you need to consider, Ray said. If we do this, there's a good chance I'll lose my job. Captain Martinez won't appreciate having one of his officers turn a routine enforcement action into a public controversy. Then why are you willing to do it? Ray thought about Katie's text message, about Lily's essay on heroism, about 30 years of enforcing laws without always considering whether justice was being served. Because I have a daughter who's proud of me for the first time in years, and I don't want to disappoint her, because I met a 7-year-old girl who understands heroism better than most adults do. And because I'm tired of being the kind of cop who follows orders without asking whether those orders serve the people I'm supposed to protect. Jim turned from the window, and Ray could see that he'd made his decision. Officer Dalton, if we're going to do this, we need to do it right. The people who come to Friday dinner aren't just recipients of charity. They're neighbors who've been struggling. They deserve to understand what's happening and have a voice in how we respond. Agreed. And we need to make sure that whatever happens, it serves the long-term interests of this community, not just the short-term goal of generating sympathy. Ray nodded. What do you have in mind? Jim pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. First, we need to document everything, every family that's been helped, every service that would disappear if the church closes, every alternative resource they'd have to access and why those alternatives are inadequate. I can help with that. Second, we need to make sure the media understands the full scope of what's happening here. Not just the arrest, but the corruption behind it, the development pressure, the broader pattern of displacing community services for private profit. Ray thought about the evidence he'd gathered against Crane. I can provide background information for reporters, help them understand the connections between the violations and the development plans. Third, Jim continued, we need to give people constructive ways to respond. If this community is going to rally to support what we're doing here, they need clear actions they can take beyond just feeling angry about the situation. Like what? City council meetings, public hearings about the development proposal, pressure on the mayor's office to investigate regulatory enforcement patterns. Jim's voice grew stronger as he outlined the strategy. The arrest might generate attention, but sustained political pressure is what will create lasting change. Ray felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety as they planned the details. This wasn't just about saving one church or protecting one pastor. It was about forcing an entire community to confront the kind of place they wanted to live in. "Pastor Jim," he said as they finished their preparations, "are you ready for the possibility that this doesn't work, that you get arrested and nothing changes?" Jim smiled, the first genuinely peaceful expression Ray had seen on his face in days. "Officer Dalton, I've been ready for that possibility since the day I decided to start feeding people without asking permission first. The difference is that now, instead of going down quietly, we're going to make sure everyone understands what they're losing." As Ray prepared to leave the church that evening, Jim called after him. "Officer, there's one more thing. Tomorrow, when you make the arrest, I want you to know that I won't resist, and I won't hold any anger toward you. You're doing what needs to be done, just like I am." Ray nodded, understanding that they were both about to step across a line from which there might be no return. But for the first time in his career, he felt certain that he was moving toward something meaningful rather than just away from something difficult. Tomorrow evening would determine not just the fate of Grace Community Church, but the kind of men Ray Dalton and Jim Morrison would be for the rest of their lives. Friday evening arrived with an unseasonable warmth that filled Grace Community Church's fellowship hall with golden light. Ray had never seen so many people gathered in the small space. Not just the usual dinner guests, but neighbors from throughout the community, reporters from 2 local news stations, and what appeared to be half the congregation from neighboring churches. Lily sat at the children's table, working on a handwritten speech she'd prepared for the occasion. Her grandmother Martha, released from the hospital that morning, sat nearby with a small oxygen tank but a determined expression. The little girl had insisted on being present, despite Martha's concerns about the stress of witnessing Jim's arrest. "Officer Ray," Lily called out, waving him over to her table. "I finished my speech. Do you want to hear it?" Ray knelt beside her chair, noting how carefully she'd written out each word in her neat 7-year-old handwriting. The paper was decorated with crayon drawings of stick figures holding hands around a church. "My name is Lily Henderson," she began, reading seriously from her notes. "I'm 7 years old, and Pastor Jim is my hero. Some people think he did bad things, but they're wrong. He does good things for people who need help." She looked up at Ray. "Is that good so far?" "It's perfect, sweetheart." Jim moved through the crowd with quiet dignity, serving food and greeting each person by name. Ray watched him interact with the families he'd been helping. Elderly Mrs. Chen, who bowed gratefully when Jim handed her a plate. Single mother Maria Santos, whose 3 children clustered around the pastor like he was their grandfather. Pete, the homeless veteran, who'd cleaned up and put on his best shirt for the occasion. At exactly 6 o'clock, Harold Crane arrived with 2 city officials Ray didn't recognize. The inspector looked uncomfortable as he surveyed the packed hall, clearly not expecting such a large audience for what was supposed to be a routine enforcement action. "Pastor Morrison," Crane announced loudly, his voice cutting through the dinner conversation, "you are in violation of the cease and desist order issued by this office. I'm instructing you to end this gathering immediately and vacate all persons from the premises." The room fell silent. Ray felt every eye turned toward him, understanding that this was the moment when he would have to choose between his badge and his conscience. Jim set down the serving ladle and moved to the center of the room. "Mr. Crane, I understand that you have a job to do, but these people have gathered here not just for a meal, but to be part of a community that cares for one another. I cannot in good conscience ask them to leave. Pastor Morrison, you are in direct violation of city ordinances. Officer Dalton, you are instructed to place this man under arrest." Ray felt the weight of every decision he'd made over the past. Weak, pressing down on him. He thought about Katie's text message, about Lily's definition of heroism, about the kind of father and man he wanted to be. "Inspector Crane," Ray said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "Before I don't take any enforcement action, I think this community deserves to understand exactly what's happening here and why." Crane's face reddened. "Officer, you have clear instructions." "The instructions are clear," Ray interrupted, "but the context isn't." He turned to address the room full of people. "Folks, Inspector Crane is here tonight because Pastor Morrison has been cited for operating without proper permits. That's accurate. The church has been serving meals and providing shelter without meeting all the regulatory requirements." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Ray could see confusion on many faces. They'd expected him to be on their side. "But what you don't know," Ray continued, "is that these enforcement actions are part of a larger pattern." He pulled out the development plans he'd discovered. Meridian Properties wants to build luxury condos where this church stands. They've been buying up property throughout this neighborhood, and every community organization that serves low-income families has suddenly found themselves facing regulatory violations. The murmurs grew louder. Ray could see people beginning to understand the bigger picture. "Inspector Crane's wife works for Meridian Properties," Ray said, looking directly at the now pale city official. "He's been fast-tracking permits for their other developments while intensifying enforcement against organizations like this one." That's completely inappropriate," Crane sputtered. "Officer Dalton, you're out of line." "Am I?" Ray held up the evidence file. "Because I have documentation showing exactly how this process works. Find violations, force closure, create financial pressure until the property owner has no choice but to sell." Martha Henderson stood slowly, leaning on her walker. "Officer Dalton, what are you saying? That this whole thing is about money?" "I'm saying that this enforcement action has nothing to do with public safety and everything to do with clearing of valuable real estate for private development." Lily jumped up from her table, clutching her speech. "Can I read my speech now? I want everyone to know why Pastor Jim is a hero before the mean suit man takes him away." The room was completely silent as the 7-year-old moved to the front, her small voice carrying with surprising strength as she read her carefully prepared words about love, community, and the difference between following rules and doing what's right. When she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Even some of the news crew were visibly moved. "Inspector Crane," Ray said finally, "Pastor Morrison is in violation of your order. But before I arrest him, I want this community to understand exactly what they're losing and why. What happened?" Next surprised everyone, including Ray. Martha Henderson began to clap, a slow, deliberate rhythm that was soon joined by Mrs. Chen, then Pete, then Maria Santos and her children. Within moments, the entire room was applauding, not for Ray's speech, but for something deeper. One by one, people began to stand and speak. "Pastor Jim paid my electric bill last winter when I had to choose between heat and my heart medication," said an elderly man Ray didn't recognize. "He didn't ask for paperwork or proof of need. He just helped. My son couldn't afford his diabetes supplies," added a woman near the back. Pastor Jim drove him to 3 different pharmacies to find the best price, then covered the difference. "My boy is alive because of this man. When my husband died, I didn't know how to pay for the funeral," said another voice. "Pastor Jim sat with me for hours, helping me call insurance companies, work out payment plans. He held my hand while I cried. That's not against the law. That's what neighbors do." Story after story filled the room. The single mother who'd found childcare, the veteran who'd been helped with PTSD counseling, the teenager who'd gotten tutoring that kept him from dropping out of school. Each testimony painted a picture of a community network that would disappear if the church closed. Harold Crane stood near the door, looking increasingly uncomfortable as the crowd grew more unified in their support for Jim. Ray noticed one of the city officials with Crane whispering urgently into his phone, probably reporting back to his supervisors about the unexpected turn of events. "This is all very touching," Crane said loudly, trying to regain control of the situation. "But emotional testimonials don't change the legal requirements. Pastor Morrison is still in violation of city ordinances." Jim stepped forward, his calm presence quieting the room. "Mr. Crane is right. I have been operating outside the legal parameters set by the city. I've served food without restaurant permits, provided shelter without meeting residential codes, helped people without following proper administrative procedures." Ray felt a moment of confusion. Was Jim about to surrender? "But," Jim continued, his voice growing stronger, "I've also been following a different set of laws. The laws that say you feed the hungry, shelter the homeless, care for the sick, and protect the vulnerable. When those two sets of laws conflict, I choose the ones that preserve human dignity." The room erupted in applause again, but Jim raised his hand for silence. "However, I also understand that Officer Dalton has a job to do, and that job requires him to enforce the city's ordinances. I won't resist arrest, and I don't want anyone here to interfere with that process." Ray felt the moment arriving when he would have to act. But before he could speak, something unexpected happened. "Wait," called out a voice from the back of the room. Ray turned to see a woman in a business suit pushing through the crowd, someone he didn't recognize. "I'm Councilwoman Patricia Williams," she announced, approaching the front of the room. "I received several calls tonight about this situation, and I felt I needed to see what was happening for myself." She looked around the packed fellowship hall, taking in the families, the children, the elderly people who'd been sharing their stories. "Inspector Crane, I'm placing a temporary hold on this enforcement action pending a full city council review of the regulatory issues involved." Crane's face went white. "Councilwoman, you don't have the authority. I have the authority to request emergency review of any enforcement action that affects public welfare," Williams replied firmly. "And what I'm seeing here tonight clearly falls into that category." She turned to address the room. "I want everyone here to understand that this temporary hold doesn't resolve the underlying legal issues. Pastor Morrison will still need to work with the city to address the permit and zoning concerns, but it does mean that these services can continue while we find appropriate solutions." Ray felt a mixture of relief and uncertainty. This wasn't the dramatic arrest he'd prepared for, but it might be a better outcome for the community. "Furthermore," Williams continued, "the City Council will be launching a formal investigation into the enforcement patterns that led to tonight's situation. If there's evidence of corruption or selective enforcement, we will take appropriate action." Harold Crane looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. The two officials with him were already heading toward the exit. Lily tugged on Ray's uniform sleeve. "Does this mean Pastor Jim doesn't have to go to jail?" "Not tonight, sweetheart. But what about tomorrow? What about next week?" Ray knelt down to her level, understanding that the child's question got to the heart of the matter. Tonight's victory was temporary. The real work of protecting what Jim had built would require sustained community engagement and political pressure. "Lily, remember how you asked me to arrest Pastor Jim because you wanted to keep him safe? Well, tonight this whole community did something even better. They stood up together and said that what he's doing matters too much to lose. The little girl considered this seriously, so we all protected him together." "That's exactly right." As the crowd began to disperse, Ray found himself standing beside Jim in the now quieter fellowship hall. "Officer Dalton," Jim said, "I want you to know that I was prepared to be arrested tonight. I was ready to face the consequences of my choices. I know. And I was prepared to arrest you, even though it would have been the hardest thing I've ever had to do as a cop." Jim smiled. "Sometimes the most important victories are the ones that require everyone to be brave at the same time." 6 months later, Ray stood in the garden behind Grace Community Church, watching Lily help Jim plant roses where Sarah's memorial garden was taking shape. The spring air carried the scent of fresh earth and new growth, and the sound of children playing in the expanded playground that had been built with funds raised by the community. The temporary hold on enforcement had become permanent after the City Council's investigation revealed the full extent of Harold Crane's corruption. Crane had been fired and was facing criminal charges, while Meridian Properties had withdrawn their development proposal amid public scrutiny and legal challenges. The Heritage Hills project had died a quiet death in committee hearings where community members testified about the value of maintaining neighborhood character and social services. More importantly, Grace Community Church had worked with the city to obtain proper permits for all their programs. The process had taken months and required fundraising efforts throughout the community, but the church now operated a fully licensed community kitchen, had met all fire safety requirements, and had expanded their services with official city support. Ray had taken early retirement after 30 years on the force, a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Captain Martinez had been understanding about Ray's actions during the church crisis, even commending him for exposing corruption, but Ray had realized that his heart was no longer in traditional law enforcement. "Officer Ray," Lily called out, running toward him with dirt-stained hands and a bright smile. "Look what Pastor Jim taught me to plant." She held out a small seedling, its roots still clinging to dark soil. "It's going to grow into a big flower that comes back every year, even after winter. Pastor Jim says that's like love. It keeps coming back no matter how hard things get." Ray knelt down to examine the plant with appropriate seriousness. At 8 years old now, Lily had grown taller and more confident, but she still possessed the same thoughtful nature that had impressed him during their first meeting. "That's a beautiful flower, Lily. What kind is it?" "A perennial," she said, carefully pronouncing the word. "It means permanent, like our family here." Family. Ray understood now that this was what Jim and Sarah had been building all along, not just programs or services, but a chosen family for people who needed one. The elderly members who had no children of their own, the single parents juggling multiple jobs, the veterans struggling with invisible wounds, the children whose biological families had failed them in various ways. Martha Henderson approached, from the church building, moving more slowly than she had 6 months ago, but with the same determined spirit. Her health scare had been a wake-up call that led to better medical care and a more manageable routine, but she still insisted on helping with church activities. "Ray, there's someone here to see you," she said with a mysterious smile. Ray looked up to see a familiar figure standing in the church doorway, Katie, his daughter, holding the hand of a small boy who could only be his grandson, Michael. Ray's heart hammered as he stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "Surprise, Dad," Katie said, her voice warm with affection. "I thought it was time Michael met his grandfather properly." The little boy, probably 4 years old, had Katie's dark hair and curious eyes. He studied Ray with the frank assessment children bring to new situations. "Are you the policeman who helped Pastor Jim?" Michael asked. Ray glanced at Katie, who smiled encouragingly. "I told him some of the story on the drive here, how you chose to do the right thing even when it was difficult. I used to be a police officer," Ray said, kneeling to Michael's eye level. "But now I help Pastor Jim and Lily take care of people, in different ways." Like a superhero, Ray thought about Lily's essay, about her definition of heroism as using whatever power you have to help others. Something like that. Katie had driven down from Colorado specifically for this visit, she explained, after months of increasingly frequent phone calls between them. The crisis at the church had somehow opened a door in their relationship that had been closed for years. Ray's willingness to risk his career for his principles had shown Katie a side of her father she'd needed to see, not the absent, duty-bound cop she remembered from childhood, but a man capable of putting love ahead of personal security. "Dad," Katie said as they watched Michael join Lily and the other children in the garden. "I've been thinking about what you said that night when you called me, about trying to figure out what kind of person you wanted to be." "What about it?" "I think you figured it out." Ray felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine. "I had some good teachers," he said, looking toward Jim, who was patiently showing a group of children how to properly space seedlings. That evening, the church held its regular Friday dinner, now an officially recognized community program that served over 100 people each week. Ray sat with Katie and Michael at one of the long tables, watching his grandson color pictures with Lily, while the adults around them shared food and conversation. Jim stood to offer the blessing, as he did every week, but tonight his words seemed especially meaningful. "For the food before us, the family beside us, and the love between us we give thanks. And for second chances, new beginnings, and the courage to choose hope over fear, we are eternally grateful." As the dinner wound down, Ray found himself helping with cleanup alongside other volunteers, former recipients of the church's help who now gave back as they were able. This was how communities actually worked, he realized, not through regulations and enforcement, but through networks of mutual care that grew stronger when people chose to invest in each other's well-being. "Ray," Jim said, joining him as they stacked chairs, "I never properly thanked you for what you risked for us. You don't need to thank me. I just did what needed doing." Jim smiled. "That's exactly what Sarah used to say when people thanked her for helping them. She'd act like caring for others was the most natural thing in the world." Ray looked around the fellowship hall, taking in the memorial plaque that had been installed near the kitchen. A simple bronze marker that read, "Sarah Morrison, Memorial Community Kitchen, where love is always on the menu." "I think she'd be proud of what you've built here." "What we've built," Jim corrected gently, "all of us together." As Ray walked to his car that night, with Katie and Michael staying at his apartment for the weekend, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the satisfaction of work that mattered, relationships that nurtured, and choices that reflected his deepest values. Lily ran up to him as he reached his car, holding a small potted plant. "This is for you," she said, "a perennial for your apartment, so you'll remember that love keeps coming back." Ray accepted the gift with the reverence it deserved, a reminder from a wise 8-year-old that the most important things in life have deep roots and lasting power. Sometimes the most innocent hearts really do see what adults miss completely. And sometimes, if we're fortunate, they teach us everything we need to know about what really matters.